The day Prince Edward walked into his father's old study at Bagshot Park, he did not feel like a winner. He stood in that room, 120 rooms around him, 51 acres outside the window, and he knew that what had just happened would never fully heal. He had won, but winning had cost him his brother. And somewhere beneath the relief, beneath the legal confirmation and the formal written retreat of the palace, there was something heavier sitting in his chest. The kind of weight that does not lift just because the paperwork says you were right. That is the part nobody talks about. Everyone covered the legal battle. Everyone reported on the documents and the lawyers and the palace's quiet retreat. But nobody stopped to ask what it actually felt like to force your own family to put their defeat in writing. To make the institution built by your parents admit, on paper, that it had tried to take something it had no right to touch. To win a fight you never wanted to have in the first place. This is that story. And it does not start with lawyers or property disputes or palace audits. It starts with a dying man in a hospital bed, holding a pen, and making sure his youngest son would be protected long after he was gone. Because everything that happened on March 25, 2026, every document, every threat, every formal letter of defeat, was the result of a decision made years earlier by a father who understood the institution he served better than almost anyone alive, and who loved his son enough to leave him a shield before he left. Prince Philip spent 73 years as the Duke of Edinburgh. That title was not a name casually attached to his public role. It was the architecture of his entire existence. Every tour, every speech, every decade of walking one step behind a queen, all of it was carried under that name. And in the final months of his life, as his body slowed and the family began quietly preparing for what was coming, Philip made one thing absolutely clear to everyone around him. That title had to go to Edward, not as a gesture, not as a consolation prize for the youngest son who had always been overlooked, as a deliberate, protected, permanent inheritance. One that would carry real meaning and real security. Queen Elizabeth II had already arrived at the same conclusion. She had spent decades watching her children closely, in the way only a mother who is also a monarch can watch, measuring not just what they did in public but who they were in private. She had seen chaos and scandal circle the family name more than once. She had watched the institution absorb damage from the very people who were supposed to protect it. And through all of that, Edward had remained steady. He had not brought embarrassment. He had not created crises. He had stayed loyal, stayed quiet, stayed inside the structure that his mother had spent her life building. So when the time came to make her final decisions, Elizabeth did not hesitate. She made her intentions clear while she still had the authority to make them legally binding and impossible to quietly undo. She did not simply promise the Duke of Edinburgh title to Edward. She went further. She signed a letter of intent that directly tied Bagshot Park, the historic Edinburgh estate, to that title. The two would travel together. One could not be separated from the other. And Philip, in the final stage of his life, witnessed that letter with his own signature. He understood exactly why that step was necessary. Without it, the palace could always construct a justification for separating the title from the home. And a title without a physical base is not an inheritance. It is just a word. Philip had spent 73 years watching how institutions think. He knew the difference. What most people still do not understand is what Edward actually inherited when he accepted Bagshot Park. The image people carry in their minds is of a prince being handed a grand estate as a royal privilege. A gift wrapped in tradition and presented with ceremony. That is not remotely what happened. When the property was first offered to Edward in 1996, it was barely considered worth saving. The building had been used by the army and then simply left. Ignored. Worn down. Stripped of any real investment for years. The Crown Estate had already been circulating the idea of converting it into a hotel or conference facility. That is how little faith anyone inside the institution had in the place. It was not a prize. It was a problem being passed along. Edward accepted it anyway. He signed a lease in March 1998 at £5,000 a year. That low rent was not generosity. It came with a condition attached that most people would have walked away from. He had to restore the estate himself. Not gradually, not over a comfortable timeline, The work had to begin immediately and it had to be done properly. So Edward did it. He put in over £1,000,000 of his own private money. Money he had earned himself, before his life became fully absorbed by royal duty. The total restoration cost reached nearly £3,000,000. The Crown Estate contributed a portion, but Edward carried a serious financial load that nobody in the institution was rushing to acknowledge. Once the restoration was completed and the building brought back to a standard that reflected its history, his rent was increased to £90,000 a year. The National Audit Office reviewed the figure and confirmed it as fair market rate. He had rescued a crumbling property at his own expense and was now paying full price to live in what he had rebuilt. His brother Andrew was living at Royal Lodge during exactly the same period. The National Audit Office documented clearly that Andrew had never paid market rate for his arrangement. One brother had taken a broken estate, restored it with his own resources, and met every financial obligation placed in front of him. The other had lived comfortably inside a royal property without ever being held to the same standard. The palace had allowed both situations to exist simultaneously, without apparent discomfort, for years. Then, in 2007, Edward made a decision that showed exactly how seriously he took his commitment to that home. Through his company, Eclipse Nominees Limited, he paid £5,000,000 to extend his lease to 150 years. He was not behaving like a tenant. He was behaving like someone who understood that permanence had to be built deliberately and paid for in full. His agreement gave him the right to sell the lease and retain the profit. He had created legal security, financial depth, and long-term control over that property through his own sustained effort. By 2026, Bagshot Park carried an estimated value of around £30,000,000. And that number is not just a detail. It is the explanation for everything that followed. Because when pressure began building inside the palace to push Edward out of that estate, it arrived dressed in the language of modernization and efficiency and responsible restructuring. But underneath every carefully chosen word sat the same reality. A £30,000,000 asset that the Crown Estate would control the moment Edward released it. Philip had been watching this kind of institutional logic operate for most of his adult life. He knew that after Elizabeth was gone, no one at the top of the structure would carry the same personal loyalty to Edward that she had. He knew that once she was no longer there to enforce her intentions, those intentions would only be as strong as the legal record that supported them. So he witnessed that letter. He made himself part of the documentation. He ensured that his name, and all the weight it carried after 7 decades of service, was attached to a document designed to protect his son from the very institution he had given his life to serve. When Edward's legal team walked into the Crown Estate offices on March 25, 2026, they did not arrive to negotiate. They arrived to place evidence on a table. The original lease agreement with its full financial terms. The complete record of every pound Edward had invested in that property. The letter of intent, signed by Elizabeth and witnessed by Philip, permanently tying the estate to the Edinburgh title. And 20 years of documented maintenance records proving that Edward had preserved and improved that estate at a level that saved the Crown Estate significant money over time. Every piece of that file had been assembled deliberately, patiently, over years. This was not a response to a sudden attack. This was a defense that had been constructed one document at a time for exactly this moment. But the legal battle over the estate was only one half of what tore through the palace that day. The other half was smaller in physical size and far larger in personal meaning. It was a tiara. And to understand why that tiara mattered as much as it did, you have to understand something about Sophie's position inside the royal family that was never stated directly but was always perfectly understood. The anthem tiara was commissioned by Queen Elizabeth II personally for Sophie's wedding in June 1999. It was built using 4 antique honeysuckle elements taken from a collection that had originally belonged to Queen Victoria. It was not borrowed from a state vault for the occasion and then returned. Elizabeth signed a deed of gift confirming that it was Sophie's private property. Her own. For nearly 20 years after that wedding, it was the only tiara Sophie wore at public engagements. That detail is more significant than it first appears. Senior royals with full access to the royal collection could rotate through extraordinary historic pieces for major events. Sophie did not have that access. The palace's internal hierarchy, never announced and never documented but thoroughly understood by everyone inside it, had placed her in a position where the anthem tiara was essentially the entirety of what she had been given. It was not one piece among many. It was the piece, the singular physical representation of what she meant to the woman who had given it to her. Earlier in 2026, before a single lawyer had been called, a representative from Queen Camilla's office arrived at the Edinburgh household carrying a clipboard. The visit was described officially as a routine heritage review, a standard institutional process, an administrative necessity. The careful, neutral language was doing a great deal of work. What the visit actually represented was a formal challenge to whether Sophie retained the right to own the jewelry given to her on her wedding day. The argument being constructed was specific. Because the gold and the stones in the anthem tiara had originated from Queen Victoria's era, the piece could potentially be reclassified as crown property. Under that reclassification, Sophie would not lose physical possession of the tiara, but she would lose ownership of it entirely. She would need to formally request permission every time she wanted to wear it. The thing given to her as a personal gift on the most significant day of her life would become institutional property that she was permitted to borrow. There is a moment from October 2019 that matters here more than almost anything else in this story. Sophie was delivering a formal speech at a reception inside Buckingham Palace. The room was filled with senior royals, dignitaries, and guests. Every word spoken in that space is typically calculated and controlled. And then, mid-sentence, Sophie turned toward Queen Elizabeth II and the word came out before she had any chance to stop it. "Mama, not Your Majesty, not ma'am, not any of the formal titles that the occasion demanded. Mama." The room held its breath for a moment. Sophie had lost her own mother when she was still young. Over years of quiet proximity and genuine closeness, Elizabeth had become something real and irreplaceable to her. Something that could not be captured in official language or royal protocol. That single word, slipping out in that controlled and formal room, told the complete truth of what their relationship actually was. The woman who had signed the deed of gift for that tiara was the woman Sophie had just called her mother in front of everyone. And now, another woman was using the machinery of the institution to take it back. Edward's lawyers responded the same day with the deed of gift. The document was clear, direct, and legally airtight. The anthem tiara was a private wedding present, not a state loan, not a shared asset held in trust, not subject to any institutional review. It belonged to Sophie, and Elizabeth had confirmed that in writing. But Edward's team did not stop there. Because in 1999, Edward had done something that almost nobody outside the immediate family had fully registered. Working with royal jewelers, he had personally designed a matching set of black and white pearl jewelry for Sophie, a necklace and earrings crafted specifically to complement the anthem tiara. The materials had been funded through the crown, but the design rights were held by Edward himself. His legal team argued that the tiara and the pearl set formed a single unified artistic creation tied directly to Edward's own creative work. You could not remove the tiara from that unit without breaking something he held the rights to. That argument added another layer of legal protection around something that was already shielded by Elizabeth's signature and the deed she had signed more than 2 decades earlier. Then came the threat that changed the temperature of the entire situation. If the claim against the tiara was not formally dropped by the end of that day, Edward's team would release a series of private letters written by Elizabeth herself, letters that stated explicitly her wish for Sophie to retain full personal ownership of her jewelry without condition or institutional interference. And according to people close to the situation, those letters contained more than that. They contained words about Camilla, about the years of cold distance Elizabeth had maintained from her, about the tension that careful public language had always managed to soften but had never fully resolved in private. Charles had spent years doing painstaking work to rebuild Camilla's public image, transforming her from one of the most unpopular figures in modern British history into a queen consort the public had gradually accepted. Those letters, released into a live legal dispute in the middle of 2026, would not simply defend Sophie's ownership of a tiara. They would pull all of that buried history back into daylight in a single afternoon and undo years of careful image management in one move. By the evening of March 25th, The tiara had not moved. And Edward had taken an additional step, placing it into a high-security private safe under the direct control of his own security team. No audit team, no palace representative, no quietly worded reclassification process was going to reach it while he had the ability to prevent that. Princess Anne arrived at a private meeting with Charles that same afternoon and did not spend a single word on polite opening. She and Sophie had not always shared warmth. For years there had been a respectful but real distance between them. Then Philip died in April 2021 and both women stepped forward, almost simultaneously, to support Elizabeth through her final year. They began seeing each other nearly every day. They were drawn together by grief and by duty and by the shared experience of watching someone they both loved slowly disappear. By Elizabeth's funeral in September 2022, the change between them was visible to anyone paying attention. As they stood waiting for the coffin to arrive, Sophie reached over and placed her hand quietly on Anne's back. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable in that vast and solemn space. But it was completely real. And by March 2026, that quiet trust had hardened into something and was prepared to defend loudly. She told Charles directly and without softening that if their mother's signed documents could be challenged, questioned, or effectively ignored, then the word of a monarch was worth nothing. And then she delivered the line that closed the argument. If our mother's signature is not worth the paper it is written on today, then your signature will be worth even less tomorrow. She was not simply defending Edward or Sophie. She was telling Charles that his own authority as king depended entirely on the unbroken chain of respect for every monarch who had come before him. The moment he allowed Elizabeth's final decisions to be dismantled for convenience, he weakened the foundation that gave his own decisions any weight at all, and also made clear that she had reviewed the Bagshot Park documents in full. She knew exactly what Edward had paid, what he had signed, what the Crown estate had formally accepted, and what it had no legal standing to revoke. She made Charles understand that this was not a gray area being navigated. This was a clear record being ignored for financial gain. Charles's own legal team delivered their conclusion not long after. Edward's position was, in their words, virtually unbreakable. The lease held. The financial investment was documented and legally protected. The letter witnessed by Philip was binding. The deed of gift for the tiara was unambiguous. No royal order, no institutional review, no restructuring mandate could override any of it. The home was Edward's. The tiara was Sophie's. Elizabeth had made those decisions while she was alive, in full possession of her authority, with proper legal documentation. They were not suggestions. They were not expressions of preference. They were the final settled decisions of a reigning monarch, and they were going to hold. Late on the evening of March 25, 2026, a formal note arrived from the office of the Master of the Jewel House. It was brief. It contained no apology, no acknowledgement of what had been attempted, no reflection on the process that had brought everyone to this point. It simply confirmed that the anthem tiara would remain under Sophie's exclusive private control. At the same time, the review of Bagshot Park was quietly closed. The official language described it as recognition of the Edinburgh household's contribution to maintaining the estate. Inside the palace, nobody was confused about what it actually meant. The Crown had attempted to reclaim £30 million worth of property and a priceless personal gift. It had been stopped, and it had been forced to say so in writing. That note will sit in the archives for a very long time. And when it is read by someone who was not alive to watch any of this unfold, the meaning will be completely clear. A claim was made, failed. The institution lost. And the evidence of that loss was committed to the official record, permanently, in the palace's own hand. Edward did not celebrate. He did not give interviews or make public statements or perform his vindication for the cameras. He had never wanted this fight. He had spent his entire adult life trying not to be the kind of royal who created problems and demanded attention. He had stayed in the background, done his work, paid his bills, restored a building nobody else wanted, and asked for nothing except to be allowed to keep what his parents had deliberately left him. And even that modest ask had required lawyers, legal threats, a formal confrontation with his brother, and a written admission of institutional failure before it was secured. Philip had known this day was possible. That is why he picked up that pen. That is why he made himself part of the legal record even as his own life was ending. He did not do it as a duke. He did not do it as a prince consort or as a servant of the crown. He did it as a father who had spent more than 7 decades learning exactly how the institution he served would behave once the people who loved you were no longer in the room to protect you. He was not going to leave his son alone inside that system without something written down. Without something that could not be quietly undone. Without proof. And on March 25, 2026, that proof held. Everything Philip had made sure to leave behind held. The title, the home, the tiara, the dignity. All of it stood exactly where Elizabeth had placed it, exactly where Philip had witnessed it, exactly where a mother and a father had decided together that it belonged. Some things even the most powerful institutions cannot take back.